Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be figuring out how to design the elements that are not present in our concept and figure out how to actually bring this model into a more functional state for in-game use. Alright, so we're in Max now, and the problem that we have with our concept is that it only shows us the front. And the fact of the matter is we do not get to see what's going on in the back. So this whole time we've only been trying to figure out what our basic proportions are up here, but never actually dealing with the back in this case, which is a bit of a problem. Obviously, our chest is meant to be used probably in multiple different angles and should have some kind of function to it, but we don't have any of that. We don't even know what that's really supposed to look like, so that's a bit of a problem for us. So what we want to do is make sure that we have a good idea of what that back should look like. Moreover, we don't actually know what the inside of this box should look like. In fact, this is not even broken apart in a way where we could open it up. But this chest, it's a treasure chest. It really should be able to open up at some point and have some sort of functionality to it. So we need to figure out those kinds of things. So basically, we've got to start setting up the functionality of this object so that we can start moving into better kinds of details. So how do we start with that? Well, the fact of the matter is we need to figure out what that structure is on the back of it. So I recommend you do research on any kind of object you're working with, real life comparisons. So for example, when I've looked at images of treasure chests and just chests, jewelry boxes and things like that, you start to get a sense of what the structure of these objects is. Now in this case, I am going to take this object. Let's see if we can just turn on backface cull here so that we can see through this so that our concept doesn't really get in our way. We'll do the same for this one as well. So we don't really need to see it bugging us like this. So what we want to do is start setting this up. So generally speaking, everything's going to have a hinge on the back. So I'm going to just turn on auto grid here so I can kind of just pull out a little tube-like cylinder here, rotate it with my snaps turned on, and just kind of put this in a reasonable position so that it can create an appropriate kind of hinge. Now, figuring out the proportions of these kind of things is important. Now again, with this piece, I am going to throw down just another symmetry modifier onto it because they're incredibly useful for us here. So what I am going to do is also just set this symmetry onto the pivot point of our box so that it matches up. And I do want to change this cylinder to being an editable poly. I may want to change the settings on this as well, just kind of pulling that down. Maybe in a few less sides. I maybe don't need 18, maybe we can just go to 12, just for a block in this case. And again, I do want to change the material here so that it's an appropriate material. But this doesn't really quite work for me. I want to have a little bit more control than this, so I can still easily edit this. So if I try to just collapse this down, I'm going to run into some trouble. And I don't have access to converting anymore in this area. So what I can do instead is actually just create an edit poly modifier on top of my cylindrical mesh, my primitive. Just right click and then go down to collapse to. And that will actually just convert automatically my cylinder primitive into an editable poly. So I find that to be a really useful way to just kind of quickly make this a usable mesh so that I can actually edit vertices and things like that really quickly and easily. So you want to get the proportion of this looking right, especially from above. Now, this works pretty decently, but this is a huge object. There probably should be a little bit more function going on here too. So we also want to think about some of these connecting pieces at the back. Let's reuse some of the elements we've already got. There's no reason we need to reinvent the wheel on them. Again, reuse is your best friend at unknown sections of a model because there's lots of situations in which you're going to be creating something. You won't quite know what it is that is supposed to be there, and so you need to invent some of those empty areas. So your best bet is always to just reuse the design aesthetics that have already been established. So in this case, let's just pull this section out just a little bit more so that it fits this area just a little bit better. I think I might need to adjust these proportions as well, but we'll wait on that for the moment. And that starts to work pretty well. This creates a nice shape from above. Now, this section back here, we don't necessarily just want to reuse these parts that are up here. And it's not necessarily the most interesting kind of shape. But again, let's try that out. I recommend a lot of experimentation with this stuff, because the more you experiment with these shapes, the more you're going to get a decent idea of what you're working with, what's actually valuable for the design, what kind of things are supposed to be there, and what kind of things aren't. So let's just kind of pull some of this stuff out. But this could really still be a foundation for the rest of what we're trying to create here. So maybe instead we rotate some of these shapes. kind of pull some of those in. Take some of these edges here, pull that in maybe a little bit, maybe pull this up so that it kind of connects with that hinge a little bit better. Maybe grab something like this and start to pull some of these areas in just a little bit. Again, we kind of want to maintain some of those angles that already exist. We don't really want to start changing these up into something like this. Again, if those angles change too much from each other, they're going to look like they don't really go together. So again, you just want to make sure that those angles, those lines, all stay consistent with one another as much as possible. So let's take this, pull that up maybe a little bit more here. And if you need to kind of recreate that angle, you could adjust and change from there. We could take this as well, maybe rotate and start to put on this top section if we wanted to. But then we got to compare with some of the shapes that exist next to it, because comparisons are always the most important thing that we can work with. So for example, you can see here, these lines don't necessarily intersect in an appealing way. They kind of counteract one another. They don't go together in an appealing way. It kind of looks like bunny ears next to these pieces. It reminds you of shapes that it's not really supposed to remind you of. But one thing that's not helping us here for design purposes is material colors. So let's just jump back into our material editor with M. Let's just double click this material that we've just created and let's adjust it. Let's make it a little bit more like a gold color. Let's darken it a little bit. Make it this nice kind of material. And you know what? Let's give it some specularity just because that's nice to do. Make that nice and yellow and increase that specular level and increase that glossiness. That low glossiness level is usually always too high. 35 is usually pretty good inside max. And we can start applying this to various objects such as this and this. Let's just select the pieces that we might want here, like this one, and I think the legs as well. And we can kind of just compare with our concept, make sure that that's all correct. And now in this case, we may want to add a material color to these pieces because this seems a little bit correct to add. So all we need to do is just in our element mode, we can actually just apply color to those things by themselves. And inside that mesh, inside that object, we can have different materials inside of one piece. And just add that there as well. So you can start to see here where this shape does not work. It doesn't feel the same as the front. It's not nice and simple. It's not nice and clean. It doesn't really match up. And it's kind of obstructing what's going on here. So again, we can start to get rid of some of those pieces to find something that's going to be a little bit more interesting to look at. Now, in this case, we could start to maybe find some other kind of solutions here, some different ways to create an interesting shape for us. So maybe let's try pulling some of these pieces in a little bit and maybe trying to recreate some of this shape that's going on here. So what I'm going to do is just use that chamfer again to kind of recreate that basic edge, but I'm also going to pull this out a little bit. Just grab that edge, hold shift and drag. It's giving me the wrong material here, which is not a big deal. Just kind of pull this open again and apply to that surface. And maybe let's pull this edge in. In fact, let's just right click and say collapse that edge. And maybe try pulling that up. We can use our snaps to kind of line that up to this edge. There we go, that'll work decently. Pull that up and start seeing how that looks from far away. Because we could start to just kind of pull this whole thing out to see if we're going to get something that's going to work nice for us here. It's pretty decent. Let's just pull these edges out here. If you're running into trouble seeing past your shell modifier, just turn it off temporarily so you can kind of see what you're working with. Grab the appropriate edges to kind of pull this in. Turn our shell back on. And just try to see what that does for us. So in this case, we start to make this really kind of interesting shape. Now again, we kind of want to maintain this as much as possible, but sometimes you got to break those rules that you've established in certain scenarios. So this works pretty decently. And the nice thing that we do start to create is this little back shape. So when we're seeing this from above, we've got this interesting little shape here. Moreover, when it opens, we may create this nice little shape that this top section could, in theory, rest on, so that we'd have sort of a functional design element here. Now, lastly, let's kind of just break this model up a little bit more so that we can use it in a more functional fashion. So I'm just going to collapse down this symmetry modifier, and I'm just going to center my pivot again on my object just to kind of make sure that that works well. And I'm going to detach this top section from the bottom. And now what I'm going to do is just attach all of these pieces to this cylinder. So let's name this properly, hinge. And you can see in our outliner over here where that hinge is. And all of these other pieces, including this, we should just drag into the hinge, meaning that when we move this hinge, the rest of those pieces will go with it, and we can start to get a sense of what this would look like opening up. Because now we can start to adjust this maybe so that we can say, okay, well, that seems like an appropriate angle to open this up at, or maybe even this. And then we can modify this part right here. Oh, let's get in here to our vert mode. There we go. And just kind of pull this down so that it hits a nice little angle there. That seems pretty good. Turn that off. Come back to our hinge. Got to get that right spot there. There we go. And we can just kind of pull this back down. With our angle snaps turned on, we'll always end up dropping it back into the same position it started. And that starts to work pretty decently as a basic block-in for us. For our next video, we're going to jump into looking at what the interior should look like and refining our details there.